On today's program, historian Barry Strauss. He's the author of 9 books on ancient history, including Battle of Salamis, the naval encounter that saved Greece and Western civilization, The Death of Caesar, the story of history's most famous assassination, and 10 Caesars, Roman emperors from Augustine to Constantine. His most recent book takes the reader into the heart of battle in the ancient world. The book, called The War That Made the Roman Empire, Antony, Cleopatra, and Octavian at Actium, tells the tale of one of history's most important yet little known wars, one that would determine the future of the Roman Empire. Barry Strauss is professor of history at Cornell University, editor of Princeton's Turning Points in Ancient History series, and a fellow at the Hoover Institution. He's not known only for his expertise in the classical world, but also for his ability to connect ancient history to right now in the 21st century. As he writes, today's brave new world of disinformation is hardly new. It's now possible to generate false information and transmit it practically anywhere on the planet instantaneously, but the facts of disinformation and its after effects are as old as war itself. What can history tell us about where we are today and what's left to be written about the world thousands of years ago? Well, Professor Barry Strauss is here to tell us. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure is mine. So, the ancient world, what draws someone to the ancient world? What is it about it? This elusive quality, this mystical quality. We get it when we walk around Rome, when we see the ruins, when we fantasize about, wow, there were really real people doing real things here. What drew you in?
Well, I think I liked it because it was so absurd. It was the end of the hippie period when I started college, and this was my way of dropping out, I suppose, to study Greek and Latin. It just was such another world that it absolutely intrigued me. And then I got the chance to travel to Greece and Italy, and then I was a goner after I actually went to those places. I knew that I wanted to spend a lot of time there and write about them and learn more and more about them.
What do you think it is that differentiates the ancient world from other periods of history? What exactly? Give us a definition first of all. What is ancient? From year what to what? And
Well, yeah, ancient, it depends on who you ask and how you're defining it. It can be everything from the dawn of Homo sapiens sapiens, I would say, to the end of the Roman Empire. In the last generation, we've come to use a term called late antiquity, which could start as early as around 200 and then continue maybe to 600 or 800, so a transitional period between antiquity and the Middle Ages. Of course, it all depends on what part of the world you're looking at as well. It's certainly very pre-modern and before the changes in the Middle Ages that affected humanity. So in my neck of the woods, we're looking at mostly at the Mediterranean, beginning in the Bronze Age, so maybe roughly around 3000 BC, continuing, I would say, to around the year 500.
what is it about the Mediterranean? We're talking Greece, Rome, Macedonia, all of these places that of course are some more familiar to modern day
Right,
listeners than others,
right,
and some have sort of transitioned to the modern world better than others. Obviously, Rome comes to mind as an example of having a
sure.
continuity all the way from 2,000 years up through now.
Hmm.
But what was happening then? Why was there such an influx of incredible intelligence, literary work, so many different things, military intelligence? What was going on?
Well, the world was young. Civilization began roughly around 3500 BCE. And at first, people thought in very concrete ways. They hadn't yet invented abstract thought. And then in the first millennium BCE, they began to think in abstract ways. They took this experience that they had in the earlier millennia and they clarified it, they purified it, they crystallized it. And so we get some of the really basic ideas of human civilization. It's been pointed out that this is not just a matter of the Mediterranean, certainly not just a matter of Greece and Rome. It involves ancient Israel, it involves India, it involves China. We can see it from place to place to place. It's really quite fascinating. A German thinker called Jaspers referred to it as the axial age because it is so fundamental to human civilization.
So you mean there are parallels that we can see in certain time periods from Rome to China?
There are, yeah,
Yeah, and this would
there
be
are.
what, a growth of intellectual life, a great expertise in a sophistication that didn't exist before.
I think Jaspers, those are all very important, but Jaspers would say that it's a focus on on human scale, that in the third and second millennia BC, we talked about empires, big things, and again, in very concrete terms. So in the Greek world, honor, for instance, in the Iliad is measured by how much precious metal you have, how many women you've taken, how many cities that you've raided. And then in the first millennium, there's such a different focus on things. You measure things based on moral qualities, on inner qualities. I think that is the fundamental change.
Let's talk about your recent book, which I mentioned in the introduction.
Right.
The War That Made the Roman Empire. A
Yes.
big title of a rather big book, I have to say. It weighs quite a bit, even in paperback. And so, why did you want to write about this, first of all, and second of all, or maybe second of all, first of all, who are the principal characters in this, and why is it so utterly dramatic and compelling?
Well, the story appealed to me for a variety of reasons. One, of course, is Shakespeare, Antony and Cleopatra, and then the various Hollywood versions, most famously or infamously, the movie Cleopatra. It involves some of the most intriguing people in history, and the fact that they were all interrelated. You've got Antony and Cleopatra, of course, and Cleopatra had previously been the mistress of Julius Caesar. You also have Antony's rival, Gaius Octavian, eventually Augustus, and Antony is actually married for a time to Octavian's sister, Octavia, by whom he has two daughters. You also have the lesser known but really very important figure, Marcus Agrippa, who was Octavian's right-hand man. You put these all together in a struggle over the Roman Empire, and really a struggle of East versus West. And the question that was at stake at Actium was, which way would the Roman Empire look? Would it be based in the West? Would it be based in Rome and look towards Western Europe? Or would it be based in the East? Would Alexandria, the capital of Egypt, become de facto the second capital of the Roman Empire? If the battle had gone the other way, the Roman Empire that would have developed, I think, would have looked a lot more like the early Islamic empires. It would have, like the Persian Empire, it would have been focused eastward. And if Christianity had developed, I think it would have become more like Orthodox Christianity. We in the United States would be speaking a language today that was based more on Greek than on Latin. And I think the fundamental religion of society would be more like Orthodox Christianity than like Latin Western Christianity. So there was really a lot at stake. Which way would civilization turn?
When you go about approaching a project like this, I imagine there's a lot written about something like this already, but you bring a fresh voice to it. Obviously, you wouldn't be doing it, I assume. So, talk about the distillation process or the research process, or this process. I assume you have to go outward and then bring it inward again.
Yeah. So what's new is a good question. So there's archaeological evidence that's new. And I feel as if I was present at the creation. Back when I was in graduate school, I visited Actium with two other graduate students who would go on to devote their lives to studying the ruins that lie about 5 miles north of where the battle was fought, an ancient site called Nicopolis, Victory City. This is a place where that after the battle, Octavian created a new city to commemorate his victory there. And he put up an enormous monument, an altar, a series of reliefs and trophies to the victory. They'd never really been studied until these folks who I went to graduate school with devoted their careers to studying them. As a result, they've given us a whole lot of new information about the battle, in part because Octavian put up captured rams from the ships of that he'd taken from Antony and Cleopatra's forces, and measuring those rams, the size of the sockets where the rams once stood, the rams themselves are long since gone, has told us a lot more about Antony's fleet. There's also been a lot of research done as to how navies functioned in this period, which also tells us more about the strategy of the players in this battle. By the same token, two other big things have happened. One is that European history has become less self-centered, some might say less self-confident, certainly more open to other points of view than its own. So a generation or two ago, people might have said, Battle of Actium, hey, there's nothing really to talk about there. Those Easterners could never have stood up to the real Romans and the Westerners like Octavian. Now we know that Antony and Cleopatra actually had a really impressive fleet, and Octavian has good reason to be concerned and worried about what he had to face. I think we've also paid more attention. We've become more conscious of the importance of logistics in warfare and special operations in warfare. Events of the last few decades in particular have taught us these lessons. And so I looked at Actium with fresh eyes. I looked at not just the battle, but the campaign. And I wanted to understand what happened in the campaign, how the other side set things up to be at such a great advantage at the time of the campaign. One other thing I would say is Cleopatra, of course. Feminism has generated new interest in women in history. Cleopatra is a very, very interesting case, and there's been a lot of great work done on Cleopatra in the last generation, and I have benefited from that.
Let's step back for a minute.
Sure.
Tell us, in the most broad terms, where is Actium? What caused this war? You mentioned a bit what was at stake, what could have resulted.
Right.
But you introduced us to the characters briefly. But take us into what actually was happening in the moment and how it got resolved.
Sure. So Actium is in northwestern Greece. It is near the modern city of Preveza, which most of us have never heard of, but it is south of the island of Corfu, which some people know from vacation. So the northwestern coast of Greece, a lesser visited part of Greece by tourists, and it is at the entrance to a gulf, the Gulf of Ambracia, which provides a sheltered harbor. So very useful, very important from the strategic point of view. The entire west coast of Greece going up into the former Yugoslavia and Albania is also very important because it's very difficult to sail along the east coast of Italy. It doesn't have many harbors, the winds are unfavorable. So sailing eastward from Italy, you want to cross the Adriatic and sail down the west coast of Greece. So an important location. Why was there a battle fought there? Because it was the border between the eastern and western parts of the Roman Empire. What do I mean by that? Rome had been bedeviled by a series of civil wars and civil strife stretching back over a century. In effect, the result of success in conquering the Mediterranean world, Rome disrupted its economy, its society, and its politics. So you get the struggles associated with the Gracchi, the war between Marius and Sulla, the war between Julius Caesar and Pompey, and then finally the war that we come to, the war between Octavian and Antony. These were the two men left standing at the end of the Roman Republic. They dominated what had previously been an independent Senate and people's assemblies. Octavian dominated the West and Antony dominated the East. And the truth about the Roman Empire was, as big as it wasn't big enough for two men to share. Almost inevitably, when there were two men who were sharing power in the Roman world, they would find a reason to come to blows. They wouldn't trust each other. Each one of them wanted to be the dominant figure. And that, I think, is the explanation for this battle. We can add the complicating factor of Cleopatra. Cleopatra was the queen of Egypt, the wealthiest independent state left in the Mediterranean. There were very few independent states left in the Mediterranean after Rome's expansion. She was also an absolutely brilliant ruler, a terrific administrator, cunning, Machiavellian before Machiavelli, a wonderful strategist, and essential to Mark Antony. She was his lover, and they had 3 children, but she was also his financier. She bankrolled his army and his navy, and some would say she was the brains behind his strategy. And some would also say that she was that she was a weight tied around his ankles, that she held him back because she had her own interests, which are not always the same as his. How's that for setting things up?
That is pretty darn good. So we have this conflict growing, which sort of sounds like something that could happen in the modern world, where we have a massive egos at play, and we have people unwilling to bend, and we have basically a competition for space and power. I mean, geographical space and power. So how quickly, we think of today, obviously, information traveling instantly. Obviously, it wasn't the case then. You don't send out a tweet and say we're invading now, and it happens now. So how quickly or how slowly did this whole thing take to develop? Or are we talking months or years? Or, I mean, how does word even travel to the people who need to know that something is about to happen?
One way to answer that question is that information travels very slowly. It typically would take weeks to get from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. It depends on the time of year. It depends how the winds are blowing. It depends where you're going, whether you're going eastward or whether you're going westward, et cetera, et cetera. But you're absolutely right. The speed of things is much slower than in the modern world. The pace of things is much slower. Then again, the pace of things was slower a generation ago, 20, 30, 40 years ago. You had to wait to the next day to get the news, or even further. So yes, people were moving at a slower pace. One way to take a different perspective, one way to look at this conflict is to say that it began with the assassination of Julius Caesar on March 15th, 44 BC, and that it takes a dozen years until 32 for Antony and Octavian to finally be declaring war, to be at open war. So I guess in the long term is a space is over a dozen years. In the short term, well, they came to blows, or almost came to blows, a number of times. They had made a peace treaty in the year 40, which was sealed by Antony, who was then a widow, marrying Octavian's sister Octavia. He already had begun his affair with Cleopatra, but that really didn't affect Roman law. And that marriage had its honeymoon, and then it was on the rocks by 35, the year 35, so within 5 years, if not earlier. Ultimately, Antony divorces Octavia, but by that time, the two sides are already at war. And his divorce of her is kind of the icing on the cake, or perhaps it's meant to show a credible commitment, that he really is all in for Cleopatra and her cause. So there's a series of steps. One of the things that happens is the military balance of power changes between the two sides. So each of them is trying to build himself up as a warlord. Antony's goal is to follow in the footsteps of Julius Caesar and to go to war against the Parthian Empire, roughly the Persian Empire, which controls Iran and Iraq, roughly, and to conquer as much of it as he can, to show that he is a great leader, and also to gain great wealth and additional arms and power. He fails. His invasion of what is roughly northwestern Iran is a failure, and he has to fight a very difficult retreat in wintry conditions back through the mountains, back to the Mediterranean coast. In the meantime, Octavian has to deal with tremendous problems of his own. First, a revolt on the Italian mainland by veteran soldiers who don't want to be forced out of their lands to make way for different soldiers. And then he has to deal with even a bigger threat, and that is there is an independent naval kingdom based in Sicily, run by a man named Sextus Pompey, the son of Julius Caesar's old rival Pompey the Great. And through a tremendous effort and through the help of his boyhood friend Agrippa, Octavian is finally able to defeat Sextus Pompey, build a navy, defeat Pompey, and win control of the West. So Octavian's stock goes up militarily, Antony's goes down, and then it starts to rise again. Because with the help of Cleopatra, Antony rebuilds his army, and Antony and Cleopatra build a terrific navy, in some ways the greatest navy of the period. So the stage is set for a confrontation between these two, and it is Octavian who pulls the trigger, if I may be permitted an anachronism. Octavian declares war not on Antony, because that would have been politically incorrect. That would have been announcing a civil war, and Octavian doesn't want to do that. Instead, he declares war on Cleopatra, which was an odd thing to do because Egypt is a Roman ally and Cleopatra has done nothing against Rome. But Cleopatra is a big threat to Octavian for political and for propaganda reasons. And the reason is very simple. It's Julius Caesar. Cleopatra had an affair with Julius Caesar, and then she gave birth to a son who she named Ptolemy the 15th Caesar. He's generally known as Caesarion or Caesarion, some people say. Caesar never acknowledged the paternity of his son, but he didn't deny it either, and he allowed Cleopatra to name the boy Caesar. Octavian was the adopted son of Julius Caesar, and we call him Octavian, but he called himself Caesar. He said he was the real Caesar, but Cleopatra and her man Antony claimed that they had the real Caesar in Egypt. So in a way, what the war is over is who has the real legacy of Julius Caesar? Who's the real Caesar?
Well, that's quite a way to put it.
Yeah.
How long did this whole thing last? How long was this war?
The war was declared in 32, the year 32 BC, and it ends in August of 30 BC. And the Battle of Actium takes place in the middle. The Battle of Actium takes place on September 2nd of 31 BC. So it's really smack in the middle. So basically a 2 years war.
2 years war.
Mm-hmm.
You've spoken a lot about leadership, and you also have connected sort of modern day situations with ancient situations. What is it about leadership that you think stands a test of time? What qualities in leaders were evident and appreciated and admired 2,000 years ago that are so too today? What are the parallels here?
Yeah, there certainly are parallels. One is the ability to communicate and to get your message out. The second is the ability to strategize, to think strategically and to think politically. Another one that I think we often ignore and underrate is the ability to have allies, and in particular, the ability to have the right number two who works with you. And I would say that Antony failed in that department. His number two, in a sense, was Cleopatra. He had some Romans who worked with him, but he offended his most important comrade, his most important collaborator, a man named Ahenobarbus, who is the most experienced naval commander he's got working for him. He's so put off by Cleopatra and what she represents that he ultimately defects to Octavian. Octavian, on the other hand, has Agrippa, and there's absolutely no daylight between the two of them. The two of them work very closely together, and Octavian understands that Agrippa is a better warrior than he is. It's not that Octavian's a coward. He's not a coward. He's just not particularly good at leading armies. and deciding what to do in the field. And Agrippa is. And to me, one of the most impressive things about Octavian is that he allows it to be known that on the eve of the Battle of Actium, he gave the wrong advice. He offered the wrong advice. He said that they should let Antony and Cleopatra escape, and they could easily follow them and win the war that way, as the provinces of the East fell into their lap after Octavian and Antony were shown to be, after Antony and Cleopatra were shown to be cowards. But Agrippa said, no, you're wrong. We need to fight at Actium. We actually need to defeat them. And Octavian was smart enough and self-confident enough to say, you're right, I was wrong. I'll follow your advice. And then to let that information be known. I find that really fascinating and really one of the marks of a great leader.
There's a shrewd communication skill there, of course. You've also written about the similarities in the field of misinformation / propaganda, which you say is as old as war. Why does it fall to the responsibility of a leader or the people in power to put out propaganda, to put out information that is, beneficial to them? I mean, it sounds like an obvious question, but at the core, why do they have to do this to keep their population in check?
I would say it's not just a matter of keeping their population in check, but it's a matter of inspiring people, especially if you're trying to persuade people to fight. You really have to persuade people to do things. You can't just force them to do things. And you have to convince them that you have the better argument and that your cause is right, and also that you're likely to win. Nobody wants to back a loser. I shouldn't say that. Sometimes people will back a loser, but it's easier to get people to support you if they think you're going to win. And to do this is a matter of communication. We hope that people will proceed in relatively honorable and honest ways. But even in the most honest and honorable campaign, there's going to be differences of opinion. If you look at the American Revolution, as Americans, we're taught that the revolutionaries were the good guys. But if you're Canadian, you're not taught that at all. You're taught that the revolutionaries were wrong. They were misguided. They were selfish. This was a silly little dispute over who was going to pay taxes, and they turned it into a grand thing about eternal principles, which it really was not. So there can be differences of opinion among people about all sorts of things, and it's the job of a leader to get his message out, or to get her message out.
Well, you mentioned the difference in the point of view that Canadians are taught something versus the way Americans are taught something. Who writes history?
Well, usually, of course, it's the victors who write history. The people who win get to write history. So to continue with the revolution, if you ask yourself, so how many monuments are there in the United States to the loyalists who supported the king or who died in favor of fighting the king? And the answer is virtually none. You'd have to cross the border to Canada to find that.
Well, should there be any here?
There might be, yeah. I mean, I don't think it's a burning issue, but there might be. It just as a matter of historical record, it's important to know that there was disputes in the 13 colonies as to which way to go. Mind you, I'm not arguing for the loyalists. I'm just saying there are different ways of looking at things.
So when you take, for example, in the back of this book, in the back of every book about history, there's a lot of notes in the back and a lot of references. And as a historian, you read other historical accounts, you read other historians, and then what you decide what's most accurate. You say, well, 9 people said this happened this way, and 25 said it happened this way, so maybe the 25 are the ones I'm going to go with. I mean, how do you balance all that with new information, for example, from an archaeological site that is sort of untouched, untarnished by the hand of a historian writing? What's the balancing act you're playing?
It's a great question. And, what can I say? That's why they pay us historians the big bucks. We have to bring to bear our skills as researchers and analysts to try to make sense of the information that we have. And you certainly don't want to say, well, 9 here, 25 there, so the 25 outweigh the 9. Often they do, but you have to leave room for a minority report and to take an unpopular position. So it's the other thing about studying the ancient world is you gather information. You know, there are always going to be huge gaps in the information we have and what the ancient sources tell us, because even when we do have a fair amount of information, there are things that the ancient writers took for granted, that they assume everybody would know. And of course, we don't know it 2,000, 2,500 years later. So we have to fill in those gaps. And a lot of the time, what we have to do as ancient historians is say, well, how did things work in the ancient world? How did people behave? How did they think? And if we put that all together, what kind of story do we come up with? So for me, that's part of it. It definitely is a bit of a detective story. It's a bit of a puzzle, and you have to put the pieces together.
Speaking of putting the pieces together, one big piece of this program, as you know, is that music always plays a role, and you've written about music before. You've written about Sinatra before, and you are a big music fan, I know. So we've actually talked about sort of music through the thousands of years on this program before with various other people. But what is music to you? Does it inspire you? Does it? I mean, it's an amazing talk about history. It's an amazing way to look at human history through music.
Yeah, music certainly does inspire me. I had the lucky experience maybe about 20 years ago to do some voice classes with a really first-rate teacher who happened to be in town for a relatively short period. And it's not that I have a great voice, I don't, but I learned a lot about how people communicate, how they use their voice, how music works. And I am quite fascinated with Sinatra. I'm a big fan of Sinatra and of jazz singers more generally. He's kind of a borderline jazz singer, of course. I think I learned a lot about communication from it, aside from the fact that I love music and listen to it all the time. I
What do you
was,
listen to?
well, I mostly listen to jazz. Uh, I listen to opera some. When I took these voice lessons, I was thinking, God, maybe I can work on being a jazz singer, and discovered to my surprise that I had more of an operatic voice.
Hmm.
Not that I have a particularly good voice for either one, but I learned something from that. So, I listen to all the obvious jazz classics. I listen to Louis Armstrong. I listen to Miles Davis. I listen to John Coltrane. I listen to Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, Sarah Vaughan, Peggy Lee, some of the more recent ones. There are a bunch of ones. Will I get their names right? Probably not. There's someone named, well, there's this guy named Emmett Cohn who has this series on YouTube. I think it's really a lot of fun. He has some really good singers on and really good performers. So I listen to a lot of that. Haven't listened to opera that much lately, but love Mozart and love Verdi and Puccini. Those are the ones I guess I most love. So
Well,
pretty basic tastes.
I would say that makes two of us. I agree with everything you just named, 100%.
Oh, good. That's great
And
to hear it.
I certainly think you could make a case that the Marriage of Figaro may be the greatest piece of music ever composed, and I wouldn't be the first to make that case. I'm not making it, but you could, and it
I
happened.
love the Marriage of Figaro. Yeah, I really love the Marriage of Figaro. It's an incredible piece.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Now, I'm curious, Professor Strauss, to talk a
Uh-huh.
little bit about the teaching of history and classics in the university setting.
Right.
Uh, we we deal a lot on this program with freedom of expression, with the idea of having multiple viewpoints, with the idea we had Dennis Washburn, who's famous translator of the Tale of Genji,
Hmm.
who spoke about, yes, in this 1,200-page novel, there are rape scenes, there is incest, there is things that are unpleasant to read about. And with his classes at Dartmouth, he doesn't shield his students from that. He doesn't believe in that. Many professors go in the opposite direction and believe that it is their responsibility to protect the students from, and maybe by that manner, protect themselves from a backlash from the students of introducing them to some of the more unpleasant sides of history or of art or of any field. What is your take? Where is your responsibility to the students versus your responsibility to the field?
That's a great question, and I think I'm with Professor Washburn. I don't think that we can sugarcoat reality. I think we have to present history warts and all. But two things I would say: sometimes, if something is really explicit, I will say to students, okay, we're now going to see something that might offend you or might upset you, and if you want to turn away or leave the room, that's okay. But it's really, I think it's worth knowing about. And on the other hand, sometimes I try to put things in perspective. So when I teach ancient Greek history, one of the big themes is Athenian democracy. And from one point of view, Athens was no democracy at all. Only native-born adult males could be citizens. And this was a slave society, and one of the more egregious slave societies in history. So it's very easy to say, nothing to see here, that's no democracy. But in other ways, it's much more democratic than our own society. And I think it's important for people to put it in perspective and for people to see both things. And also for people to say, hey, it was 2,500 years ago. Maybe people didn't have some of the advantages that we have today. So I try to, put all that into the mix.
In what ways, just to drill down on that with a finer bit drill, in what ways was it more democratic than our society? Because that's an interesting statement. I'm curious.
So in our society, we say you've done your job as a citizen if you voted and if you do jury duty and pay your taxes. But Athenian democracy was direct democracy, not representative democracy. So every citizen had to hold a public office once in his life, and it would just be his life. And that would be typically sitting on a board of 10 for a period of a year. That's a significant commitment, much more than in our society. It's much more likely that an Athenian would be called upon to do military service than we would be in our society today. It's true that if you go back 70, 80 years, things would have been different in the United States and in most of the West, but that makes Athens very different from our own society today.
That sounds like it might be something useful for us today to say you have to sit on a board of 10 with 10 people who have different viewpoints from you for a year and see what happens. I think that might do a lot of good, no?
I completely agree. And if I may, so I had the experience to be on the board of zoning appeals in my town a number of decades ago.
Is this by choice or by
I was
force?
asked to do it. And at first I thought, are you kidding? I don't know anything about this. But then I thought, well, I teach Greek history, I teach ancient democracy, I should do this. And I did. And I don't know how good a job I did, but I certainly learned a lot. It was a humbling experience in a good way. I learned an awful lot.
And I imagine most people on the zoning board up in upstate New York weren't necessarily professors in your department.
No, there were no professors in my department. There was a professor from I think urban planning, and he was great because he, unlike me, he actually knew something. but it was really useful and interesting, and a great experience in democracy.
What is the culture in your classes? Do you find pushback? Do you have students who are saying, you know what, it's time we don't talk about this, it's time we don't cover this? Do you find there's a resistance that you feel, or a sort of simmering uprising that you feel that maybe you didn't feel 10, 20, 30 years ago as a professor?
You mean for political reasons?
Yeah.
Not so much. And that's in part because my courses aren't required. Nobody's required to be there. If they're there, it's because they want to be there. And I think in part because I've tried to change with the times. So while I'm telling the same basic story, I realize that America has changed, American society has changed, the world has changed. So probably when I started teaching Greek history in the 1980s, it wouldn't have occurred to me to compare Thucydides with Sun Tzu. But now I do. I think it's really important. I think it's really important that people see how the ancient Western way of war was different from the ancient Eastern way of war. So that would be an example of things. I think that probably I wouldn't have paid as much attention to women and to gender in teaching ancient history. I can't say that race is in the center of what I do, but I do bring up issues of race, both in the ancient world and in the way the ancient world has been used or abused in the modern world. It's kind of an interesting story and a complicated one, but I try to bring that in as well. I don't want to pretend that nothing's changed since I went to graduate school in the 1970s. Things have changed a lot, mostly for the better. So I want people to see that in some ways, not so much for the better. But yeah, I think that's part of it. I don't get a whole lot of pushback from students sometimes on political grounds, but not so
What would
much.
that be, for example?
I think sometimes students might say, well, you don't really see my perspective. You don't really see my point of view. I've had students say that, and I always try to say, okay, I'd like to see your perspective. So let's talk. Let's have a conversation about it. And I've learned things from students. I think from having kids of my own and watching them grow up and seeing the world they grow up in, I think I learned a lot about how things had changed. Maybe not enough, but I think I learned some. And I think it's our job as professors, and I think it's probably my take on the world, that we want to preserve what's good about tradition and about the past and the old. But by the same token, we want to recognize that generations change, that it's just part of the human condition that things change from generation to generation, and we can't stand still. So we have to, I think, make reasonable compromises, focus on what's important to save about the past, to pass that on to the future, but also recognize that young people are coming from a different place and a different world. And of course, American society has changed enormously demographically, culturally, racially, in various ways in the last few decades. And we want to take that into account as well.
In terms of studying classics, what is it about the language that you think is important? Why is it important to study Latin or ancient Greek? From a cultural point of view, I mean, I'm saying it as someone who speaks multiple foreign languages, and I've always enjoyed the study of foreign language and found it very important for me. I understand foreign language is not for everybody. Some people it just doesn't resonate with at all. But I think in a way it does bring you to a different place, and everybody has their own voice in a different language in which they speak. I think my voice in Italian is probably somewhat different than my voice in English. And so when we study an ancient language, isn't there a direct link to the past that's kind of visceral and important?
Anche per me è lo stesso, non sono la stessa persona italiana, non è vero? Okay, yeah.
Esattamente. That's
Esattamente.
Point taken. Exactly.
Yeah, you're right. You're just not the same person when you speak a different language, especially Italian, which is a wonderful language.
It's true.
But you've said it. I don't think you can really understand the mind of another culture, or it's very difficult to understand its mind without dipping into its language. With Greek and Latin, they're also so important because they're so fundamental to Western civilization. And like it or not, that's where we are in Western civilization. And if you want to understand it, you need to study the language. Latin, I think, is particularly useful for English speakers to learn. It's a little more accessible than Greek. Greek is absolutely wonderful, but it's a little bit more difficult, not least because of the alphabet, which really can be surprisingly difficult as a stumbling block for learning. But Latin can open a lot of doors, and it's logical in a way that English isn't. Latin, and I guess in German the same is true to a large extent. It comes basically from one root, and in English there's so many different pieces, so many streams feeding into English that it's hard to figure out how things fit together and how they work, and grammar. Well, we don't have much grammar in English anymore, but Latin has a lot of grammar, and I think it helps people to think logically, to put things in place. And for some people, it's very helpful that you don't really have to speak Latin. It's good to speak Latin, but you don't have to. You can just read it, and that can be useful for people as well. But again, such fundamental ideas, and in Greek, even more fundamental ideas for Western civilization. You can get that so much better from the language than not having a language. Just one example, the Greek word polis means city-state, of course, and we get our word politics from it. But in ancient Greek, politikas, politics, polites is citizen, politeia is regime, constitution, way of life. The book that we call Plato's Republic in Greek is the Politeia of Plato. So it's clear in Greek that he's not just talking about the constitution, he's talking about the way of life. So they end up, they have the word for politician. It's clear that they're all part of the same thing in a way that you don't get if you look at it from English.
That is fascinating. Barry Strauss, what is next for you? We have this book here, The War That Made the Roman Empire, your most recent book. You have other books. What is coming down the pike? What are you working on right now?
So a bit of a departure. I'm writing a book called Rebels, Jewish Revolts Against Rome. And I'm looking at the broad span of history from the Maccabean period, 2nd century, BCE, all the way up to the Islamic conquest in the 7th century, but with particular focus on this period of 3 revolts from the Great Revolt beginning in 66 to the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135. I'm interested in it from the point of view of the rebels, from the Jewish point of view, but I'm also interested in it from the point of view of the Romans, because I'm a Roman historian. And I'm also interested in the geostrategic questions of how the 2 Persian empires in this period, the Parthians, the Sasanians, how they fit into the picture. And I think there's some really, it's also a detective story. They're fascinating questions. They're questions about military history and strategy, but they're also questions about culture and abiding questions about how we look at the past. I found this a strangely contemporary project, and I've been jarred at the perspectives that people have on it that are often very different than what I would have thought they would have been.
And some people may not know that there were many Jewish slaves in ancient Rome who built a lot of the city, no?
They did, yes, the Colosseum. So the Colosseum was built in part, it was funded by loot from the conquest of Judea after the first revolt, the Great Revolt. And surely some of the builders of the Colosseum were Jewish slaves, because many thousands, if not tens of thousands of Jewish slaves were brought to Italy from Judea. So yes, certainly.
I remember seeing in one of the big archways in the Roman Forum, there's a small menorah carved into the side of that. And maybe you know what I'm talking about, but it's very striking indeed.
You mean the Arch of Titus?
That's right. That's right. The Arch of Titus. Yeah.
Fascinating monument.
Well, I'm sure that will be in the new book as well as many other things.
It will be.
When it happens, you'll come back and discuss that with us as well.
Oh, thank you. I'd be delighted to do that. Thanks very much.
Well, it's Professor Barry Strauss. There's so much more to learn. Your books are fascinating. This latest book, The War That Made the Roman Empire, fascinating, and you do illuminate and respect history at the same time. And for that and for this conversation, indeed, I thank you.
You're very welcome.